Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the Global Media Charter. This one-hour webinar is being recorded. I'm Laura Baeyens, Communications Manager at the World Federation of Advertisers, and I manage WFA's network of National Advertiser Associations. And just a quick word about WFA to kick off this webinar for those of you who may not be familiar with WFA. Our purpose is better marketing, and we enable effective, efficient, and sustainable marketing worldwide. And we do this through our unique global network of over 100 of the world's biggest brand owners and national advertiser associations in 60 countries. So for today's webinar, we have my colleague Matt Green, the Global Lead of Media and Digital at WFA, who will give an overview of the Global Media Charter, which sets out what advertisers think needs to change in digital media today. He will also report on developments and progress being made globally on this charter. We will then have Stephen Chester, Director of Media at ISBA, which is the Advertiser Association in the UK, and Holger Wilks, CEO of the Danish Advertisers Association, who will be sharing on the recent initiatives that their respective organizations have been leading on to make the measures outlined in the Global Media Charter a reality. So after the presentations, we will then have a live Q&A. And if you have any questions about the Global Media Charter and for our presenters during this webinar, please feel free to raise them through the Q&A button below your screen. So my colleague, Hannah Van de Ven, and myself are facilitating this webinar, and we'll make sure everything runs smoothly. Before I hand over to Matt, we will launch a quick poll, which you will see on your screen shortly, just to get an idea on the level of awareness about the Global Media Charter within this group. All right, interestingly, 35% of you said no, that this webinar would actually be the first time you're hearing about the Global Media Charter. So hopefully through this webinar, we get to clarify everything and all the questions you might have about the Charter, given that most of you might have only heard about the Charter for the first time through this webinar. Without further ado, handing over to Matt.
Thank you very much, Laura. That's great. I am interested to see that so many of you haven't heard about the Media Charter, which is good and bad, right? There are probably some recognition problems that we need to deal with, and that's why we're doing webinars like this one. Right, so as Laura said, my role at WFA is to sort of help on all media and digital issues, and the Media Charter therefore sort of falls within my realm. These are some slides, some images that you'll probably be familiar with. It's fair to say that we've been doing this slide for a while now, but it still serves quite well, I think, as a trigger to refer to all the media challenges we're faced with at the moment. And this bar chart here it's a couple of years old now. I think it's 2017. And it speaks to the main challenges that our media community are grappling with right now. And it's a bit of a leading question, are these escalating or not? So these are the main challenges being addressed by our media community: brand safety, viewability, fraud, transparency. And this is the context within which our Media Charter sort of came to life, really. We find ourselves in this perfect storm where there are a number of issues within the media space, and they all need to be fairly urgently addressed. Now, there are a number of clients, this is probably one of the most well-known slides you'll have seen, there are a number of clients who are being quite vocal about these issues. So we heard very recently from Mark Pritchard on the left. He's the Chief Brand Officer at Procter & Gamble. We heard from him, and he said at the ANA's conference a couple of weeks ago, he said, we need a new media supply chain that levels the playing field and operates in a way that is clean, efficient, accountable, and properly moderated for everyone involved. Good for consumers, brands, industry, society. And also we heard from Keith Weed very recently at WFA's conference in Lisbon. He said, we've passed the tipping point. This is no longer an industry issue, it's a societal issue. And as the advertisers who fund the industry, we need to take greater responsibility. And interestingly, some clients have moved on from this kind of positioning to actually trying to act upon these sentiments. So top right hand corner, this is a screen grab from Diageo, a piece of work they did. They called it their trusted marketplace. These principles, and we've seen similar principles from TCCC, the Coca-Cola company, their responsible marketplace principles. And then very recently, Unilever have announced that they're going to launch something similar, their Unilever Trusted Publisher. So we're seeing these marketplace principle initiatives pop up, and it's basically about trying to get a more quality ecosystem, trying to influence the ecosystem so you're having more direct control about who you're trading with. And it's these initiatives which formed the basis for the Media Charter, which we launched about 1 year ago. And this is what it looks like. It's quite familiar. It's quite similar to the Diageo look and feel, because we that's what we do. We borrow with pride from other organizations, and there are some great principles here. They're not rocket science, frankly, but they're just foundational, sensible steps that we need for the industry to implement. So we talk to the need for zero tolerance to ad fraud with compensation for any breach, strict brand safety protection, minimum viewability thresholds, which we should also have the option to trade on the viewability threshold of our choosing, transparency throughout the supply chain, third-party verification and media measurement as a basic, the removal of walled garden issues. We want to improve standards with data ethics and data transparency, and we want to fundamentally improve the user experience. It's probably the most important one, really. So that is what the Media Charter is about. And this is about balance, and it's about timing, because most barometers point towards a decline in consumer trust towards advertising. So we recognize the need to address this soon, now. So these are our principles for partnership. And when we talk about principles for partnership, we mean with agencies and with the media owners and the platforms who provide the means for us to communicate with our audiences. So sometimes we're talking about transparency. That's more often talking to the media agency community, though not always. When we're talking about walled gardens, I think it's clear we're talking about the issues we might have with platforms. So for each of these different principles, there are a number of asks we have from the ecosystem, but equally, as responsible brand owners, we're making a number of commitments to the ecosystem as well. And this is all covered in the full Media Charter document, which you can access directly from our website, wfanet.org/media charter. You can find it there. Please do have a look after the webinar. So this launched about a year ago, and there has been some progress against some of these principles. I'm not claiming that's all due to us, but this webinar will be about talking to some of the work that associations that we can see, and some of the work that associations such as ISBA in the UK and DAA in Denmark are working on to progress these individual principles, because we know that many clients, many markets as well, will be 12, 24 or more months into a plan to respond to these same issues. And that's encouraging, and it's good. But the Media Charter was always about trying to increase adoption and increase education and understanding of these issues on a local level. We're trying to, if you can pardon the pun, we're trying to catalyze a Mexican Media Charter wave around the world, because we believe that effective local solutions can be scaled to good effect. So we're really looking forward to hearing from Steve and Holger in a minute. And I'll get out of the way. I'll just talk to two of the principles here, just to sort of give a bit more context around them. We could probably look at any of them. I've decided to focus on transparency and then brand safety. And this is, it's probably fair to say that transparency is now more of a global issue than it has been in the past. It's historically been something which has been more bordered, and that is less the case now, because digital has enabled the propagation of many of the transparency problems we face. Supply chain complexity, arbitrage, rebates, the whole principal versus agent issue. So these are problems which are very much inherent within the digital space, within the programmatic space, and digital is kind of unbordered. So whereas this chart speaks to transparency per market. I think if you looked at this again today, you might find that it's more flat than it has been in the past, because transparency is increasingly a global challenge. And in the past, there were markets which were thought to be more clean than others, and that's increasingly recognized not to be the case anymore. And the US was one of those which was thought to be relatively clean for transparency problems. And the ANA's seminal piece of research in 2016 uncovered actually there was quite a bit of transparency problems within the US media buying industry. And that's what that blue cover speaks to there. And this is a rough media transparency timeline, because there's been quite a lot of events over the past couple of years. I'm not sure if the sequencing is exactly right, but I think these are some of the events that I've picked up on. We've seen an increase in auditing, financial auditing in particular in the US, then a wider adoption of fully disclosed deals, particularly in the programmatic space, as clients have sought to move from an undisclosed to a disclosed sort of place where they can have better scrutiny of what's going on within their deals. We've seen a re-examination of agency models and agency relationships, with many choosing to switch from agency trading desks into independent trading desks, or even moving into in-housing. This chart at the bottom shows a growth of in-housing. You'll notice that agency trading desks, the threshold remains the same at 70%, but we've seen more and more clients experiment with different models in different parts of the world. So there's been exploration as people have sought different approaches. So the growth of client-side programmatic in-housing came next, and this is an interesting comment here. Clients think, some, that biddable media buying is a commodity that can be done with the right technology as well in-house as an agency, and I think this is a divisive issue, and I think there are those that would say that's not the case, but it is clear that there is a will and appetite to do more in-house, although I think even the most successful mature in-houses would probably say they still need agencies. We've seen the adoption of the ISBA and the ANA media services frameworks, the templates that are basically delivering off-the-shelf transparency. It's a template that you can put in place with your agency, which is really valuable, and that we've seen quite a lot of take up with those documents. Next, we've seen, I think this is an interesting area, with the growth of independent and alternative agencies. So for agencies, one of the undesired outcomes from the transparency furor has meant that the door has been opened to rival businesses who are kind of unencumbered by the legacy issues that network agencies are grappling with. So we've seen a raft of more agile independent agencies rise up, and some have actually adopted the ISBA framework off the blocks. And then, of course, there's the managing consulting groups who are moving closer to the programmatic space, but have a very different fee model to agencies and are likely to reject the behaviors which have catalyzed some of the problems that we're seeing. So this timeline continues. 2017 was very clearly the year of blockchain. I'm not aware of many blockchain solutions which have been put into place yet, but there are. It's clearly very promising, and I think we're bound to see this come up in 2019, 2020, and there are so many use cases for blockchain. It could be really instrumental in fixing financial transparency, ad fraud, and other areas as well. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this space unfolds, and I know that Steve's got some interesting insight to build on this. So what does the media charter say about transparency? Well, it asks for complete transparency throughout the supply chain, digital or otherwise. We require details for pricing and trading, including disclosures of all rebates, free space, AVBs. It should also be clear on what basis the agency is operating. Is it principal at law or agency at law? Fees and costs. We need disclosures of all media and technology partners involved in the supply chain, including the costs associated with each. And then placement. We must receive clear and specific descriptions of ad placement and context. And finally, data. It's critically important that we receive disclosures of data used or associated with any transaction. This must be provided, and details should be provided for how that data is stored and how it can be accessed by advertisers as well. But it is a two-way street, and our commitment to the industry is to ensure that we do respect our partners' right to be profitable, and we pay them appropriately for the services rendered. That is the least we can do, because we have to acknowledge that clients have been complicit or have helped to provoke some of the problems that we're in. We're not entirely absolved of guilt. So that's transparency. And then the other one I thought I'd touch on briefly before I hand over to Steve is brand safety. And this has been one of the most defining issues of the past couple of years. There have been a number of fallouts, problems within this space, which you'll be very familiar with. Back to 2017, the whole discovery of ads being run next to terrorist content. More recently, there have been some worrying problems with child safety and pedophile comments underneath videos on YouTube. And then very recently, we've had the awful live streaming post of the Christchurch massacres. So there have been some really big problems here. And we think that this is a really big problem that we have to hold these companies to account for. And as our colleague Lindsay Moat at ANZA, the New Zealand Association of Advertisers, says, this is not an issue of brand safety anymore. This is a moral question to hold social media platforms to account in the same way that we do for traditional media. So we have to put pressure on these platforms to change their behavior. And we think that we can make a difference by working as a collective. That's what WFA is for, and that's what we can do. So we have to keep on applying pressure to the platforms, because we think that these challenges cannot really be addressed by one country in isolation or one company in isolation. We need to act together collectively to persuade these companies to change. So what does it say in the media charter about brand safety protection? Well, we ask these platforms to accept responsibility for the content carried on their sites. We ask them to be meticulous in how advertising is placed alongside content on their sites. We need more rigorous safeguards. We know that there have been a lot more safeguards put into place by Facebook and Google, a lot more safeguards put into place, a lot of them based around technology and AI, but these need to be even more rigorous than they are. And then considering the commitments we make to the ecosystem, we acknowledge that some advertisers may have become accustomed to levels of audience, reach, and frequency, which may not always be possible in a comprehensively brand-safe world. We, as advertisers, accept that reach and brand safety may not always be an and conversation, but an either-or conversation. It may not be possible to always have the level of reach we've been used to and always be brand safe. That's something we have to accept. We do think that sustained advertiser pressure can make a difference, and we've seen that recently, clearly. We've seen that YouTube has suspended comments on videos of kids in the wake of the child safety incident, and we've seen that Facebook has hired a bunch more human moderators, brand safety contractors, to monitor their platform. It's worth pointing out that they've hired 30,000 more people. That is still a pretty slim amount. I mean, we can't expect Facebook to hire, 2.7 billion people, which is the amount of users they have, to moderate their content. But an interesting piece of context is that those 30,000 contractors would mean that there are effectively one moderator for every 75,000 users. So that's frankly not going to cut it. But we're not asking for one moderator per user, but it's interesting when you look at the numbers in that context. There is still a massive need for technology, and technology can be problematic. It doesn't always work. So we need to see those technology safeguards be suitably rigorous. Okay, that was all I had to say. There is much more in the full Media Charter document, of course, which you can access from this link that's on screen. Feel free to reach out to me at any time if you want any further context about how we're working on any of these other issues. We've got some initiatives coming along for many of these different principles. But now I'm going to get out of the way and let Steve talk about some work that he's doing in the UK. So Steve, do you want to take control of the slides?
Marvellous. Thank you, Matt. So I'm going to talk about a project which we're undertaking in the UK, which sort of observes the fourth principle of the media charter, looking at the programmatic supply chain. And this was really inspired by the great work that WFA did, which many of you will be aware of 5 years ago, looking at the programmatic supply chain. And this is just one slide from that expansive report, which I'll encourage you all to read if you haven't done already. And it looked essentially at the programmatic supply chain as it was in 2014, and looked at averages in the market in terms of the take rate, the charges and the fee charges by each type of business in the programmatic supply chain. And then the report was updated further in 2016, looking at what element potentially might be fraud as well. So when looking at that chart, the conclusion that most advertisers came to was, sort of horror, essentially, that very little of their media spend was actually arriving at the end publisher. But it doesn't mean to say, of course, that all of the entities in the supply chain aren't offering value. That many of them indeed are, and they're offering you the ability to target audiences very specifically. But the question is, are they offering you value, or are they unwanted costs, and are they charging too much? This was followed up in 2017 by the ANA in America, working with a forensic company called Adfin, where they were actually tracking money through the supply chain on a very forensic basis. So in this case, they were actually taking log file data, and they required them to actually go into the agency to grab the client data. And then they spent about 3 months processing the data to actually follow the money. And they could follow it as far as the ad exchange. But because they didn't have data beyond the ad exchange from the publisher, they had to estimate what they thought exchanges and publishers were charging. But it appeared to show, and this is in the States only, that the amount of money landing with the publisher had improved a little bit from the global report that WFA did, showing that the publisher was receiving between 60 and 55 cents, 54 cents in the dollar from through the supply chain. So about 40 to 45 pence in the pound was being taken out of the supply chain. But it should be noted that there are other studies that have been done individually by publishers, notably The Guardian in the UK and the FT, who are both very canny, and actually, as marketers, because they are also advertisers, they actually bought their own inventory, and they actually looked at how much money came back to the publishing side of the business, and they each found that only 30 pence in the pound, so only 30 cents in the euro, was actually getting to them. So again, 70% being taken out in the supply chain. So we looked at essentially what we could do in the UK, because we were very interested in looking at whether or not the UK market would mirror what was being seen on the global report through the WFA or the ANA, and whether or not margins had improved and there was more working media landing at the publisher. And knowing that, of course, in the 2 years since the ANA reports and in the 5 years since the WFA reports, the number of players in the market has changed substantially, and we've seen some consolidation in the market. So looking at this, we wanted to try and follow the money all the way through to the publisher, which hadn't been done before. And that required us to work with publishers to sort of mirror what had been done in previous studies, which was to work with clients and agencies to gain access to the DSP data, so looking at log file data, to look at the buy side data, and then working with publishers to gain access to the SSP data, so we could look at the money going in from the clients and arriving at the publisher, and then following the money through the supply chain and looking contractually at essentially what each entity in the supply chain, what its costs were, what their margins were, and then looking at the money going in, the money going out, and seeing whether or not there was a delta and discrepancy between what was contractually being charged for and what was actually being charged for. So as part of this, we then decided to partner with the AOP, which is the Publisher Association in the UK. And we went through and sort of reviewed a number of possible partners for this. And we settled on working with PricewaterhouseCoopers, not least because they are very neutral and steadfastly neutral. They don't offer competitive business with agencies. So our chances of success of actually gaining access to the DSP data through the agency were much greater. It should be pointed out in the ANA study, which was a super study, because they were looking to, through the company Adfin, looking to access the DSP log file data from the agencies. And they were looking to take it off-site, whereas PwC are looking to audit on-site. That meant that the agency and Adfin had to go through a very protracted legal discussion about gaining access to that data. And in some cases, it took up to a year to gain legal access to that data. And of the 28 advertisers in that study that wanted to press ahead with the study, 21 advertisers were refused access by the agency because the agency stated that they had proprietary data which they could not separate. So we wanted to take a different approach that would sort of collaborate with agencies. And we're looking at essentially, margins and potential obfuscation further down the supply chain, notably around the ad exchanges and SSPs. So we took an approach to work with PwC because they are steadfastly neutral in that they offer an auditing business, but they don't offer any competing consultancy services with the agencies, and partnering with the AAP to gain access to publisher data. So in terms of what we hope to achieve, because at the moment we've currently just undertaken recruitment of advertisers and publishers. So we're about to go into field with the study in June, end of May possibly, but more likely June and early July. We'll then go through an analysis period in August, and we'll look to publish an industry report in September. Each of the individual audits being undertaken by each advertiser will remain confidential. And then what we'll do is we'll aggregate all of that data to create an industry benchmark report, which we'll publish in September. So what do we want to, what do we think we can gain access to in terms of data? Well, on the advertiser side, we'll look at spend, we'll look at the agency fees, we'll look at the trading desk fee, DSP fee, any third-party data fees. We'll look at display and we'll look at video across desktop and mobile. We'll look at percentage of impressions that can be analysed. What we're hoping to do is to look at log file data from DSPs. If we can't gain access to log file data, because we're looking historically back we're taking a 3-month period likely to be Q4 of 2018, but we'll make that decision when we actually go on site to do the audits to see what data we can access, because the further it is historically, the less likely there is to be log file data and more likely to be aggregate data. So ideally, what we want here is the granular log file data. And then what PwC will do is they'll match the log file data on the buy side from the DSP to the log file data on the publisher side through the SSP, and they'll seek to follow the money through the supply chain. So as well as all the fees, declared fees from all the parties in the supply chain, we'll also hope to look at essentially the relative performance of each DSP based on the fee it charges and its performance, and we'll do the same on SSPs on the other side for publishers. And what's most interesting here, of course, is that on the buy side, you rarely get to see what's happening at the SSP and exchange side. And for publishers, they don't really get to see what happens to DSPs on the buy side. So we'll have a report here for publishers and agencies and advertisers where they'll be able to see the full supply chain, which they would not normally be able to do. So the process is very simple. We're going to do a series of interviews, which are going to be qualitative, so more of an interview-based approach, asking questions about the industry and about programmatic buying and their views. And then we'll go through the quantitative side, so at the actual measurement and auditing side, where we will seek to, or PwC will go to the agency on site, or we've got a couple of advertisers who actually have an in-house solution. So in that case, we will go to the client site, and they will seek to do an on-site audit, looking through reporting and looking through live data on the agency or client systems. What PwC will not be doing is taking that data off-site, because we've said that involves a lot of a very prolonged legal process of gaining access to and taking that data off-site. So just a couple of slides here before we wrap up about the sort of data which we're going to see. We'll look at the open exchange. We'll also look at private marketplaces. If we can get enough data, we'll also look at programmatic guaranteed as well. And we'll look at the averages for the all-up report average for open exchange buys. And then each individual client, and this won't be in the all-up report that will be published in September, this will remain private. Each individual advertiser will then see an average and look at what their margins are, and the margins by each of the partners, and the fees that are charged by each partners against that all-up average, which will seek to average all of the results from all of the audits. So they'll be able to look at relative performance. Those advertisers we'll see in a moment are from a range of different sectors. So we're not saying that this will be the all-up report should be an average which should be rigorous and should be rigorous for all advertisers, depending on how advertisers plan and buy. There may be some variance, and depending on the kind of inventory that you procure, you may be procuring more expensive inventory. If you're going for private marketplaces and open exchanges where it's cheaper, it'll be a little bit cheaper, but at least the study will give a relative idea about the average of a number of significant brands in our market. We'll then look at the, essentially looking at the spread here of the average against where each individual client is, so almost a heat map of looking at the fees that are charged by to you as the clients against the project average. We'll then look to do a heat map, so you'll be able to see how each brand will be able to see how it plots relative against the other brands in the study. The important aspect here is that in the all-up study and in the private audits, we won't seek to identify all of the advertisers individually because that data will, of course, be confidential. But in the individual audits that each brand gets, they'll see where they are benchmarked against the other, where we think it's going to be another 19 brands. There'll be 20 brands in the study. So they'll be able to look at their relative performance and look at how efficient their buying is. Again, this is just another couple of slides to show the sort of data they'll get. We get to see a sort of plot against each DSP and its relative performance, and they'll look at the expected fee structure based on the contracts that you actually have against the actual fees and costs that are tracked through the supply chain. And the same will be done on the exchange and on the SSP side as well. So you'll be able to look at their against expected against actual, and then look at the relative performance of each. And there'll be a series of recommendations in each of the individual audit reports. Clearly, obviously, then seeing which of the exchanges and which of the SSPs are the most efficient for each client so they can make choices in terms of who they contract with. And the hope here is that we will see anywhere between 10 to 15% cost savings. So on a relative spend, of course, a modest spend of €1 million for programmatic, we'll hope to see clients see 100 to 150,000 euro saving by the recommendations they'll receive in the report. Today here we've got 16 confirmed advertisers, but we have another 4 advertisers who we think will be joining the study, and so we hope to have 20 by the time we close out at the end of this month. And in terms of publishers, we have 15 publishers signed up in the UK. I haven't put these down here because some of these are localized to the UK, whereas obviously more of these brands are more sort of ubiquitous and global in nature. But we're hoping to get 20 media owners and publishers signed up to this. It should be pointed out we don't have Facebook or Google or any of the large platforms because taking part in the study requires access to their log file data, and we knew from the outset that they would not give permission to their log file data and take part in the study. So this is really looking at premium publishers and looking at large media owners outside of the big platforms. So our hope is then in September, we'll publish the all-up report. What we hope this report will be is essentially an insight into the UK market, but moreover, essentially an insight into the commercial and operating models in programmatic advertising in general, because the UK market is not significantly different to other markets across Europe. So hopefully the findings will be useful to you. And rather than just being one report, what we're also looking to follow on from this report are looking, as Matt alluded to earlier, at some always-on solutions where you can actually have clients can track their money on a more permanent basis rather than this one-off auditing process that we're seeing here. So ISBA, with a number of trade associations under a body called JICWebs in the UK, has partnered with a blockchain company called Fiducia to actually look at a blockchain as a possible solution to creating an ecosystem where you can follow the money in the supply chain on a permanent basis. That pilot is just about to begin in the UK. It'll run for about 6 to 9 months, and we'll then be in a position to establish by the end of this year or beginning of next year whether or not blockchain is a potential solution to supply chain transparency.
Fantastic. That's very, very interesting. Some quite pioneering things going on there, Steve. We'll take questions, any questions there might be at the end, but let's move over to Holger and then we'll take questions at the end, shall we?
Thanks for WFA for inviting me. My name is Holger Wilks. Since September 2018, I had the pleasure to work as CEO for the Danish Association of Advertisers. Here's my contact information. Don't hesitate to send me an email, call me for a chat if you have any questions about this particular session in this webinar or anything else. Let me take you back to the situation in 2018 and paint a picture of what we as an association faced. It can best be described as trench warfare. In 2017 and the early parts of 2018, our association had published 2 studies on the state of media transparency, and frankly, the results were quite shocking. Advertisers, to a large extent, had lost faith in the media agency partners. They felt that digital media buying had become a black box with its secrets closely guarded by media agencies. And what's more, many advertisers felt that the agency no longer had the client's best interests at heart when they made the media recommendations. Instead, the media agencies sought to maximize their own revenue. Now, in such a frankly sorry state of affairs, you would have thought that media agencies would look for ways to rectify the situation, and that the Danish Association of Advertisers would work hard to provide tools and solutions that could further media transparency. But unfortunately, none of that really happened. Our association was content with simply presenting the 2 studies, which showed that the Danish media market basically was a mess, and that they did no further. Meanwhile, media agencies were busy fighting the very concept of media transparency, primarily in the trade press. They attacked our studies and simply refused to acknowledge that yes, there is indeed a problem with media transparency in the Danish market. So when I look at the media transparency agenda again in September 2018, when I started, both advertisers and agencies were entrenched as if this was the Western Front in 1918. So fast forward from 1918 to 2018, we had to move on, and we did so by focusing on one major insight. 8 out of 10 Danish advertisers no longer trust their media agency. 8 out of 10. Just think about that for a second. It's obviously a huge problem for agencies, but also for CMOs. As everyone working in that position can testify, trust in your agency partner is paramount if you want to build a successful marketing value chain. So what I did was I went on a tour to every major media agency in Denmark and spent a lot of time talking with their CEOs and with those media agency professionals who had fought our media transparency agenda the hardest. My goal there was to convince them that we had a shared interest in closing the trust gap between agencies and advertisers. Basically, I wanted to put an end to the blame game and reboot the relationships. And not surprisingly, once you actually start a dialogue, it turns out people have good intentions and common sense, even in media agencies. So the final step was to look for actual solutions and develop a plan, which we then presented at a kickoff conference in December 2018. Here we basically invited everyone who had a stake in the media market. And we identified the 5 key areas. We took our cue from this guy, we've probably all heard of, Mark Pritchard from Procter & Gamble, who I think it's fair to say kickstarted the media transparency agenda back in 2017. So what we did was we looked at his 4 focus area, and we closely examined the WFA's global media charter to pinpoint the key areas that were most relevant on the Danish market, namely about media transparency. And these turned out to be the 5 you look at here. Transparent media agency costs, transparency about conflicts of interest, transparent documentation, brand safety or prevention measures, and last but not least, transparent data management. So let's look at each of them individually. Transparent media agency costs are really about all the visible costs, costs that you as a client know that you're paying, that you can negotiate in your contract without any let's say, expert media consultancy knowledge. But then there's all the hidden costs, what's beneath the iceberg. Our aim is to enable transparency into these costs as well. The second key area is about the transparency into conflicts of interest. If you as a media agency are paid €1 for suggesting one type of media, and you're paid €7 for suggesting another type of media, and at the same time you can see your your stock prices fall, now which media would you suggest to your client? I think the answer is pretty obvious. There's obviously the conflict of interest, which is largely based on different media incentives, different tech incentives, and of course shareholder pressure. The third area is transparent cross-channel documentation of viewability, cost, data management, etc. Basically, it's aimed at getting a straight answer to the 5 fundamental questions you as an advertiser can ask. So, where has my ad been shown? Has a human being had an opportunity to see it? And if he or she has, is that human being actually part of our intended audience? How much did the placement cost? And what was the effect? Now, these are all 5 fairly simple questions, but getting a straight answer from a media agency on these questions can turn out to be pretty hard. The fourth area is about the brand safety and fraud prevention measures. Ad fraud has become the 3rd largest form of organized crime in the world, after narcotics and human trafficking, which also means that ad fraud will become a focus point for governments and legislators at some point, since organized crime at this level destabilizes nations and actually is a national security issue as well. So if we want to step in before legislators do, we as advertisers, publishers, agencies, and tech vendors have to come together now and stop this problem before it escalates, before it turns out to be a problem that is beyond our control. Last but not least, the 5th key area is about data management, data ownership, and which is especially important in Europe, GDPR compliance. Now, my take on this is that you would be hard pressed to find any European programmatic buying setup that is actually GDPR compliant. And I know that the Danish authorities, at least, are looking for this for the first time this year. So we will probably see some major fines by end of this year. So these are our 5 key areas. And our goal in all this is that media agencies should be able to guarantee visible ad exposure to real human beings in the most effective media channels with measurable proof of viewability delivered to a clearly defined target group that can take actions which drive business results. Now, that's a fairly long sentence, but it also distills what it is we want to achieve. And here's how we aim to achieve it with less talk and more action. So basically, what we do is we work with 4 different streams: a contract stream, a documentation stream, a knowledge stream, and a conference stream. Let's talk about the contract first. Okay, sorry about that. There we are. On the contract side, our colleagues at the British Advertisers Association, ISPA, have been tremendously helpful and have shared their framework for media buying, which basically is a template for media agency contracts. What we will do is that we will produce a Danish version of that template. So currently I'm looking for funding for that project. So if anyone here should happen to have a spare €80,000 lying around, please feel free to buy them to me afterwards. Now, jokes aside, you should know that the Danish market is characterized by a disproportionate number of small and medium businesses. For them, a template of 40+ pages of legal text simply will not do. So once we have the Danish version of the entire ISPA contract, we will ask media agencies and our own members to identify the most critical areas. And based on that, we publish an ISPA Lite, which focuses on the main transparency issues regarding costs and regarding data management. This lighter version will be much more widely adopted in the market. In the next stream, we look for ways to improve tracking of campaign elements in the digital ecosystem. So we have partnered with the French company EDPUP and are currently testing their Trust ID solution together with a publisher, a media agency, and 2 major Danish advertisers. Now, Trust ID is basically a unique identifier that advertisers can link with every single piece of advertising in a programmatic buying campaign. So, as an advertiser, you can trace your campaign throughout the entire value chain, right down to individual third-party vendors and actual media placement on a URL level. Our esteemed colleagues in the French Advertising Association are doing a similar test with Trust ID, and with a hopefully successful conclusion of both tests, the next step to convince IAB Tech Lab to manage the OpenRTB protocol, which handles all programmatic buying, to allow that extra line of Trust ID code needed. With that in hand, the advertisers can illuminate the black box that the programmatic buying used to be. The third step is, the third stream is working with white papers. So, because media transparency is really all about being able to ask a media agency the right questions. So for each of our 5 key areas, we have published 3 white papers, and we publish 2 more with an overview of the topic and suggestions for improved transparency. Finally, we have a conference stream. As mentioned earlier, we launched this plan in December 2018 at a kickoff conference. In April, we invited large Danish companies to an in-source conference with talks from industry experts and case studies, companies such as Arla Foods and Lego. In June, we will invite CMOs to what we dubbed our programmatic school for advertisers. The goal here is to demystify programmatic buying. So basically, we will start from scratch and simply draw the entire ecosystem with DMPs, SSP, DSPs, data vendors, and so on a blackboard, along with costs and data streams. We will use this to pinpoint the potential pitfalls and highlight those potentially problematic areas that advertisers should focus on. And lastly, we will discuss how and where to place programmatic buying in an effective media strategy. Lastly, we will invite to yet another conference in September aimed at those advertisers that will continue to rely on media agencies for their media planning and buying. And the focus here will be on how you can re-establish trust between the 2 parties based on full media transparency. Let me quickly move on to the results. Now I know you can't read this, but what it basically says is that we have moved on from 1918 and trench warfare. Media agencies in Denmark have largely embraced our media transparency agenda. Even those who fought us the hardest into 2017, they have acknowledged that yes, lack of transparency is a shared problem, which calls for shared solutions. We have also been able to move the media transparency discourse beyond the trade press, from being a fringe debate in marketing media. The general business press is now interested in the topic. And all this has been achieved in 6 months, and we are far from done. But I think it's fair to say that we gained a few learnings, and that's the last slide I'm going to show, which is what we learned. So first of all, identify one major pain point. We could have tried to push the entire global media charter agenda, but we would have failed. Instead, we focused on what was clearly the most important pain in the Danish market, namely a lack of media transparency. Next, break the main issue into manageable parts. If you're about to eat an elephant, you will have to chop it up and eat it one bite at a time, right? Never try to push your agenda by yourself. Look for common ground and ally with as many stakeholders as possible. Media agencies should be valued partners and not treated as the enemy. Also, remember that execution is everything. Intentions and manifests are pretty much worthless unless you turn them into actions that can and will deliver immediate value for advertisers. So be tough, weed out buzzwords, and concentrate on those areas that can really make a difference. Lastly, never stop communicating your agenda. You and your colleagues will probably tire of repeating the same message and push the same agenda again and again and again. But remember, what seems vitally important to you will be insignificant to others until you convince them otherwise by staying on message. And on that note, I think my 15 minutes are pretty much up. Thanks a lot for listening, and do get in touch for any further details you might want.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Holger. That was great. We haven't had tons of questions. However, I've got a couple for you. We're just pretty much at time, but if I can just ask you a couple of questions. Holger, firstly to you, what you're doing there makes a lot of sense. I think the program of communication via conferences and then more concrete initiatives such as Trust ID seems like a very sensible way to address the transparency problem, and it makes sense to focus on the most sort of pronounced problem in the Danish market as well. But could you, about Trust ID, is that effectively, sort of another version of what Steve just walked us through? Is that how you describe it? And more pertinently, is that something you think other associations can borrow and use in their markets?
Trust ID is a fairly pragmatic solution and a fairly simple one. It's basically just a question of putting yet another code line into the container tags of a programmatic buying campaign element. So while blockchain technology may be future and may be even able to deliver even faster media transparency, what we basically do with Trust ID is that we build let's call it documentation track, a documentation highway that you as an advertiser can use to actually trace each individual vendor who has managed your digital campaign element at some point in time in the programmatic ecosystem. And then it's up to you as an advertiser to demand documentation from that vendor about the costs and data management. So it's not a spaceship, but it's a W Beetle from the 1970s that can be implemented pretty fast, and that could probably solve at least 90% of the transparency problems that advertisers have when working with programmatic buying.
Okay, well that sounds like something worthwhile for sure. If we can resolve 90% of the problems with something like that, then we should all be pushing for that. So maybe that's something for you associations on the call. Maybe that's something to consider for your markets. There is, as you pointed out, we need to put some pressure on the IAB to make some changes to RTB. But that sounds really interesting. And then one question for you, Steve. How long did it, because what you're doing is pretty massive, really. How long did it take you to sign up all those clients? You said, were there 20 clients you have on that initiative? Which is very impressive. How long did it take? And is that something you think other markets can reproduce?
I think it absolutely is. I mean, it's taken to actually get those advertisers on board probably about 3 months.
Not bad.
We have to go through we're just actually delivering the contracts this week to those advertisers. So there might be a bit more delay where they actually seek to review the contracts, with lawyers redlining, but relatively smooth in terms of the recruitment. What's taken a bit of time is to find the right partner in the PwC, to find a methodology where we can be confident about accessing, about getting trying to put the data together to try and actually follow the supply chain. And actually it's probably taken, we delayed this by 6 months, so it's taken in total about 12 months to actually look at the approach, which is, that we've taken, which is actually working with another association, the Publishers Association in the UK, the AAP, and then working and having to brief clearly, bring in 15 to 20 publishers, as well as the 20 advertisers that we've got on board. So you've got 40 companies committing, who each need, of course, briefing calls. They want to know obviously what they're going to get. And it should be stated that for this study, each client, because it is a private audit, they are paying £20,000, or roughly about 25,000 euros for the study. But normally, this isn't a media audit. This goes much further. The media audit looks at the agency relationship and the client. This obviously goes through the supply chain, so it complements your media audits. Normally, PwC is sort of assure us they normally charge in the region of about probably 50,000 60,000 euros plus per clients. But this is new for them. The reason they're, of course, discounting it is because they obviously want to work with other markets. So to answer your question very simply, they are very keen to work with other markets and other advertisers in other markets. So if people are interested, just drop me a line. I can put you in touch with them, and we can take it from there.
Interesting. Very interesting. Okay. Well, two great presentations, Laura. Would you agree? Would you like to sort of wrap us up?
Yes, indeed. Thank you again, Steve and Holger, for that. Okay, thank you so much again, everyone. And again, as Matt mentioned, you could download your copy of the WFA Global Media Charter on our website at wfanet.org. Again, thank you so much. And if you have any further questions, please do not hesitate to contact me or contact my colleague Matt. And I'm happy to provide the contact details for Steve Chester from ISBA and Holger Wilks from the Danish Association in case you have any questions about their presentations. Again, thank you so much and have a lovely rest of the day. Have a good evening, have a good afternoon, and have a good morning.